So you had corporations that started actually participating in the development of this policy. And private prisons are a great example of that. These were corporations that started working with legislators through different associations. One of the most common that we often talk about is ALEC. But they, helped write things like the three strikes laws, some of the mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing laws that deny parole in many cases to people until they've served a big percentage of their sentence. And so these companies participated in the drafting of this legislation that now everyone has touted as not just legislation that was ineffective in addressing crime and issues, but also was incredibly racist and had a wild disproportionate impact on Black and brown people in our country.
Hello and welcome to the Prison Cells podcast. I'm your host, Robert Craig, and alongside me is John Dacey, the Executive Director of Abolish Private Prisons. How you doing today, John?
Doing great, Robbie. Thanks.
Also with me is Tank Johnson, the founder of Native Creations here in Arizona and a consultant to Abolish Private Prisons. Tank, how you doing?
Hey, what's up?
And joining us today is Bianca Tylek, the founder and Executive Director of Worth Rises. How are you doing, Bianca?
Hi, Robbie. How are you?
Great. The weather's great here in Arizona. It's, like 75 and sunny outside. How is it in New York?
Not quite that, but it's actually unseasonably warm, so it's not bad. I went outside last night with no coat, which in mid-December, is typically not possible, and it definitely is this year.
Perfect.
Global warming.
Yeah, exactly. There's some marginal upsides to come along with the sort of depressing, soul-crushing other part of it. So let's hop right into this episode. We're going to talk about the evil startup, how profit has gotten itself into the criminal justice system. And I know Worth Rises is really invested into sort of working against this whole system. So can you tell us a little bit about Worth Rises and the kind of work that you're doing?
Absolutely. So Worth Rises, we are a national nonprofit criminal justice organization that works specifically to dismantle the prison industry and end the exploitation of people who are incarcerated and their loved ones. In other words, anyone who is building their wealth or otherwise profiting off of mass caging of people or the control of our communities are people that we consider targets. We really want to build a society in which no entity or individual depends on human caging or control for their wealth, operation, or livelihood. So I don't care if you're a private prison CEO making $6 million a year or you're a correctional officer making $30,000 a year. We want to shut down the industry and shift the economy away from mass caging.
So I know Tank last time when we were talked about the CoreLink system, right? The phone system.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, and so if you think about it, I have an app on my phone. It's a CoreLinks app, and that app basically is it's the vehicle in which I communicate with my loved ones who are incarcerated, and also give them money. And some of the surcharges involved with CoreLinks are just kind of it's just slap in the face, right? It's like you are trying to actively help someone behind bars. And a part of that is contributing to the resources that they can participate in. And if you're getting these just kind of, egregious taxes, for the average family across the country, that becomes a burden, and those people become left behind in prison. And so just kind of seeing the business model of the money that they make, it's really putting people at a disadvantage, and it's affecting them just grossly.
Yeah, I think people have in their minds, the sort of media portrayal of what it looks like inside of a prison, right?
Right.
You have all these government actors that are the prison guards, and the people that are working, often are the prisoners themselves. Bianca, can you talk a little bit about all the different ways that the
Mhm,
private corporations, the for-profit people have, it's not just phones, right? I mean, that's one, but there's a lot.
mhm. Yeah, and I think it's important for people to know even what core links is. What Tank's talking about is a system that exists specifically in federal prisons where people can communicate through electronic messaging, but you are in large part charged for that, or you can deposit money for a loved one who's in prison. You're charged fees for that. Telecom is in large part a big piece of this. In fact, 1 in 3 families with a loved one in prison goes into debt just over the cost of calls. So this is a really big issue that impacts so many families that have loved ones inside. But it's way more than that. It's commissary prices, right? That are exuberant. I mean, we're talking about products that are often worse quality than they are on the outside, that are actually sold for 2 or 3 times the price, right? We're talking about healthcare. Many prisons and jails around the country, people inside are charged medical copays, despite obviously not earning very much. But on top of that, it's just also the healthcare companies that often provide really terrible healthcare for essentially government contracts, and collect millions and millions of dollars from those contracts. You have food service providers. You have the contractors who build prisons and jails. Obviously, you have the private prisons, which sort of dominate most of the airwaves. But there is an endless industry that really stands behind and supports and uplifts and then profits off of mass incarceration. It's an 80 plus $1 billion industry that we're talking about. And that's before we even get into conversations about prison labor and the exploitation that happens there. And, we have to just understand that in many ways, incarceration is a public private partnership. Um, that seeks to exploit, and what I say is traffic Black and brown bodies for white jobs in rural areas, and just more broadly for people who have wealth and have no scruples about how they make that wealth.
And to kind of piggyback off of that, there's this thing, right? It's called like the prison tax, right? And so we know that anything on the street has a price, and if you put that in prison, you can basically quadruple it, right? So whatever you're and that's with the inmates, right? And so like if they're smuggling stuff in or whatever, the price is quadruple. And it seems like these prisons have taken that same business model, right? Like, if you get it inside
Mm.
of a prison, you got to charge quadruple or something crazy, and so I think there's that dynamic of that the inmates have a system of which they kind of use, and the people who are overseeing these industries, they're doing the same thing as the prisoners, and unfortunately, there's no trickle down to the prisoners or their families for any of this. So I just thought it was really kind of like glaring that both people are playing the same game, and it's just extremely unfair.
Well, that's exactly why I call it a public private partnership. Because what a lot of people don't know is these corporations that sell these different products, whether it's commissary products or telecom or whatever, in most cases are actually sharing the revenue or profits or proceeds with the county jails or the state prison system
Right.
in what are essentially legalized kickbacks, but they're commission models, right? Where essentially the same thing goes on telephone calls. Those rates, whatever is paid to the company is actually split with the jail. So they have every incentive to do the same thing. So it's pretty horrendous in that way. I'm
Yes.
gonna pause for 1 second. Tank, can I, if you would bless me with a moment of grace, which is to say, if we could not use the term inmates or prisoners, I would really appreciate it.
Oh, sure.
So we do. Yeah, we do, and I'll just share really quickly. So language is obviously really important. One of the things that we always talk about is that when we like label people with some of these things, which is the same language that obviously like correctional officers and cops use and da da da. We forget that they're people. And usually when we if we could just refer to people as people in prison, it gets people to sympathize more with that idea as opposed to them being like, well, I just don't know inmates, so I don't have to care about inmates.
No,
Um,
I'm with
so
you. No, like, listen, humanizing, I deal with it, right? So humanizing
mhm,
anyone or any situation is always the better route. And so uh thank you for lacing my boots and putting me up on game on that. That's big. But
I got you.
I was gonna say, last night I was, talking to my wife, and she was like, yeah, when you called from jail, those calls, came out to be like $600, and we're talking about
Mm.
5-10 minutes where I know they're listening, and I'm just trying to tell her just pertinent information. Those were in excess of $600, and that, again, that was passed down to my family, creating that burden.
Yeah,
Bianca,
and
are
there's
these?
a really important thing that you're raising there. Oh, sorry, if I can just it's gonna be 1 second. There's something really important that you're raising there, which is that it was, um, women who are supporting what we found 87% of those that are carrying the cost of incarceration, and specifically the cost of communicating with people inside, are women, and disproportionately women of color.
Yeah, I mean, I I I assume that these things are all charged like per text or per minute. Is that still how the revenue is being made?
Yes,
In many
yes,
Like,
cases,
yes,
yes.
yeah.
yes.
We've seen a few deviations now. We're actually working on some innovations in this field that might change that. In fact, San Francisco has recently just signed a very different type of contract. But overwhelmingly, of course, we are still in this place where we are charging in 2021 toll rates per minute rates for people to be on the phone, some as high as $1 a minute.
Yeah,
What's
and just one real quick, yeah. So my buddy who's in Red Rock Private Prison, they actually are getting they're able to do a video message on like a tablet, and it's a 30-second thing to kind of tell their family or whatever. But the price of the 30-second video is, your family has to be able to contribute for that. And so it's a different way of communicating, but that's kind of the newer thing that specifically Red Rock has gone to.
Yeah, I just remember, when cell phones were first coming out, they used to charge per text and per minute and everything. You have to purchase blocks. And when that change happened, I don't remember when it was, the early 2000s or something, where text started to be free and
Everybody
minutes
used to
started.
run out of minutes.
Yeah, exactly. I just remember there was such a liberating
Wait till
feeling.
9 o'clock to
Wait till
call
Yeah,
nine.
again.
yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah,
Nights and weekends, nights and weekends.
yeah.
And you had to circle with friends or whatever that you could call unlimited. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I just
They're like,
remember
are you
this.
in my crew or not?
Exactly. I just remember this sense of not having to think about it anymore, and the burden that relieved when when I'm talking to my friends or something and I don't have to check how many minutes it is, or I don't have to worry is this text that I'm going to send to my friend, is it worth the 10 cents, or is it worth my if I have a package of 100 texts, is this worth the communication or whatever?
I mean, look, we can talk till we're blue in the face about the injustices that they put on us. But, for example, let's say someone in your family dies, right? And you want to go to the funeral, right? Like, you've got to come up with basically the travel cost for the guys who are, for the workers who are going to take you to and from the funeral. And oftentimes guys, don't get an opportunity to see their loved ones off because they can't afford it. And whenever you're denying basic human rights just because people can afford it, then you're talking about a system that is broken,
Or it's not broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do.
or that perspective.
Right. So maybe that's a good lead in. How did we get to this point where we are here today? You said that's how it's designed to work. How did we get there?
Yeah, I think the system is the criminal legal system is was designed in a very particular way, right? And the way in which it was designed was to accomplish exactly what it is successfully accomplishing. Right? This is actually a very efficient system in doing exploiting people, particularly Black and Brown people who've been marginalized by our society and by our laws. And so, how did we get here? I mean, I think there's many ways in which we got to mass incarceration. We're talking really more specifically about like how we got to profiteering off the system at this like level, right? We got to go back a few decades when mass incarceration really started taking off. And that was, early in the 1970s, 1980s, which is when we started seeing a lot of changes in policies of the federal government that were driving incarceration, like the war on drugs. And it was in the 1980s that corporations started to observe this massive uptick in people behind bars. And in seeing that, thought to themselves, well, here's a opportunity, a business opportunity. So you had corporations that started actually participating in the development of this policy. And private prisons are a great example of that. These were corporations that started working with legislators through different associations. One of the most common that we often talk about is ALEC. But they, helped write things like the three strikes laws, some of the mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing laws that deny parole in many cases to people until they've served a big percentage of their sentence. And so these companies participated in the drafting of this legislation that now everyone has touted as not just legislation that was ineffective in addressing crime and issues, but also was incredibly racist and had a wild disproportionate impact on Black and Brown people in our country. And since then, that task force has sort of been dissolved, and those companies like to claim that they are no longer doing such things, but the damage has been done.
Yeah.
Right? Those laws still
Yeah.
exist. And our people are still in prisons and jails all over this country because of that. It's really interesting. Sometimes I hear people say, whenever I talk about right profiting, they'll say things like, well, if you did the crime, you should do the time. Right. And I'm like, do you ever think about why certain things are even crimes? Marijuana legalization in this country has only taken this long because of the powerful corporate lobbies that have lobbied against it, right? The specifically alcohol, pharma, and private prison industries were some of the biggest lobbies against marijuana. Now, of course, some of them have now, especially alcohol, have found ways to monetize it and now are supported. But for many years, they invested a lot of money in preventing the legalization of marijuana. So when we think about what's a crime in our country, even that is shaped by corporate interests.
Yeah, and it's funny, right? Like they have these public statements that they'll make either by themselves or through their PR corporations. The Day One Alliance is a trade group that represents a lot of these industries.
Day One Alliance is a joke.
Yeah. And they will proclaim until they're blue in the face that they don't influence criminal justice policies, right? But it's all public knowledge. Like you can go to Open Secrets and see that they're donating money to people that are running candidates, and they have a lot of money that they're spending on lobbying. So, it's if I'm a business and I'm spending all of this money, my shareholders would be really mad if I was not trying to get something out of it, right? Like they've got to be spending it to do something. And the only thing that makes sense that they're doing is to make sure that their business not only keeps going, but gets better.
Yeah, I mean, just similar to any industry, right? You kind of have to, adjust your business model with the times, and kind of piggybacking off what Bianca was saying is, essentially, once they stopped or quote unquote abolished slavery, they needed to figure out a way to continue to keep these people uh, under control and working for free, and essentially reaping the same benefits uh, of slavery post and post that era. And so there was this grand scheme put together to do that. And in a lot of ways, I mean, like she said, the system is working perfectly the way it was designed, and it's just it just shows that these people can be light years behind the eight ball and really not even realize it.
At APP, we believe the only way to truly end for-profit prisons in the United States is to challenge the constitutionality of private for-profit prisons in the courts. And with your help and moral courage, we will succeed. Completely donor-funded, we ask for your support. Your tax-deductible contribution will provide vital funding for building the infrastructure necessary to win a fight of this scale. And every dollar will bring us one step closer to our goal of abolishing private prisons. Please join the fight today by visiting abolishprivateprisons.org and click the donate button at the top of the site. And of course, like, share, and subscribe to the Prison Cells podcast from wherever you listen. Now back to the discussion.
Yeah, one of the ways that we talk about it at Abolish Private Prisons is thinking about the story of, how did we get from slavery, the chattel slavery that everybody thinks that's what slavery means, even though there's a lot of other definitions of it. How do we get from there to private prisons? And just thinking about private prisons as only the latest, incarnation of slavery, right? And when you look at the things like the Black Codes and redlining and Jim Crow laws and all of the different ways that people have been, restricted and made subhuman in a lot of ways, right? And so we just think about it, we call it an evil startup. That's one of the things that we're talking about today. But really, it's more like the latest incarnation of something. And it's just a different formation that slavery takes today, right? And it's always about how can the people that have power, who tend to be, especially in the United States, the white people, how can they use the legal system, right? How can they use government to write laws to keep other people, other groups of people, to not have access to the same things, right? How can they continue to extract value off of those bodies?
And I mean, in my mentor programs, that's one of the biggest things that I'm trying to get across to these young men and women is that it's a part of a much bigger scheme, right? Like it's not on the surface, and these kids go out and make these decisions that affect their lives for a long time because they think it's just kind of it's just I go to jail and I get some credibility in the streets and all that, but they don't really know that they're entering into a system that is going to squeeze them like an orange and get every drop of money out. And then when they're done, they're going to discard them and hopefully that they degrade into the earth, when it's all done. So I'm just trying to get people to see that picture and hopefully that offers a deterrent.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, we do know that prisons and jails don't work as a deterrent, but hopefully, our conversation, right, which is that, I think that it's really easy to find yourself in the criminal legal system. It's remarkably hard to get out of it. There's a really brilliant exhibition of a corn maze done by an artist by the name of Jesse Crimes that touches on this. That was literally about, finding your way in is a straight path. Trying to get out of the criminal legal system is nearly impossible. But in terms of some of what you were talking about, Robbie, around the history of how we get to mass incarceration from chattel slavery, I think we really, really, really need to unpack that conversation, and people really need to understand that we've 100% recreated.
Bianca, what does unpacking that do?
So I think unpacking that helps us understand why we have mass incarceration the way that we do today, right? And what labor looks like. I mean, so for example, 1865, 13th Amendment passes. And, we just did a poll and we learned that roughly 70% of people don't know that there's an exception clause in the 13th Amendment. And that exception clause, in particular, says except as punishment for a crime, which has been understood in many different ways, but most commonly to still allow for involuntary servitude and even slavery in prisons. And so that what people don't know after 1865, that exception clause was exploited by many states, particularly in the South, who then passed, as Robbie mentioned, Black codes. These were laws that only applied to Black people recently freed, that criminalized just about anything about liberated life, with the largest set of these laws being tied to vagrancy, which means being in debt was therefore a crime, but only for Black people, right? Not having a job or being unemployed was a crime, but only for Black folks. And what that allowed the system to do was incarcerate people, criminalize people, incarcerate people. And then they launched a practice called, and I quote, convict leasing. And this practice basically meant that states could, once they've incarcerated someone, lease people to, in many cases, private individuals and corporations. We, in many cases, saw people who had just been freed from plantations working in involuntary servitude or through slavery on those exact same plantations, some of which went to actually become prisons. And they are commonly referred to as plantation prisons today. It's still all through the South. And in fact, by the turn of the century, states like Alabama were making 73% of their state revenue by leasing people who had been incarcerated. And it's important to note that after 1865, the prison population in Alabama and other places went from being 99% white, because naturally Black folks were actually on plantation, to being 99% Black because of Black codes that sought to essentially capture everyone who had just been released, right, by the government, by the 13th Amendment. And so what you see then is the beginning of a system that was designed, right, to capture Black people, which then extended to brown people, which then extended to poor people. And we have now the system that we have. And we have to be reminded of how many things in our current system actually date back to slavery. Think about solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is a practice that dates back to slavery. It is the hole, right? It is the hole where you put people who were enslaved, who rebelled or resisted. You put them in a hole and you didn't give them food and you didn't give them light and you didn't give them access to people. That's solitary confinement. In many prisons, it's still called the hole, right? When people refuse to work, they can be denied visits and calls with their family. That's a practice that dates back to slavery, right? Where you took women, children from their mothers, right? Who resisted. So many of those practices, we still have jobs in the fields in prisons, jobs in the facilities down south, and they talk about that as like the field and the house, right? So there's so many practices that exist in our carceral system that have their root in antebellum slavery, and it starts with the sheriff on horseback capturing enslaved people who had run away, right, and who are still doing that in our communities today.
Right. That's some of the very first instances of what, like, private jails, right? Where these slave recapturing houses where they would just have these small places. And the only purpose that was there for was so that when these sheriffs would capture slaves, they had some place to store them for some amount of time until they could gather up groups large enough to make it worth transporting back to the plantations that they just came from. So, right, like you can see, as Bianca was saying, there's all of these little like mirrors. Every time we see these incarnations of a different kind of privatized system to extract value from people, every time you look back, there's another mirror, right? And like Bianca was saying, these Black codes were only applying to people that were just freed, right? But a lot of times they were written in a race neutral way. And not all the time. There were some that were written in certain ways, but that is just how the war on drugs happened, right? You have these supposedly neutral laws that, of course, disproportionately affect people of color. And it's just another example of how every time you look, it's just another piece that looks exactly the same as the thing that came before it.
Yeah, no, I mean, and just kind of like, when I asked Bianca, like, what's the value of unpacking it, it shows oftentimes a direct line between the original and where we are today, and just by shedding light on that, I think you're going to adjust the stream of consciousness around it by being able to shed that light on the direct link to the original thing of slavery.
So maybe that's Bianca, what is Worth Rises doing to sort of fight against this, right? Abolish Private Prisons has its strategy of using the courtroom, direct litigation, constitutional challenges. What is Worth Rises doing?
Sure. Thank you so much. So I think there's a number of things, right, that I know we're working on. One, our entire mandate is to challenge the prison industry. I mean, every component, every actor, every institution who thinks that it's going to build wealth off of putting people in cages, we're coming for you. And we do that very aggressively, everything from passing policies through legislation or directly with administrations and executive government officials. Things like one of the things we're sort of best recognized for is our prison phone justice work, which has been moving quickly across the country. As I mentioned earlier, phone calls can cost as much as $1 a minute in some places. We have started passing legislation around the country to make phone calls and communication in prisons and jails free, as it should be. And we passed the first piece of legislation to that end in New York City back in 2018, making New York City the first place in the country to make phone calls out of its city jails free. That saved directly impacted families roughly $10 million a year, and increased call volume by 40% overnight. That's how many people, families were trying to connect who couldn't because of the simple cost of a call. And since then, we've been able to get San Francisco there, support Los Angeles and San Diego, and also just pass legislation in Connecticut, making Connecticut the first state prison system to make communication entirely free. But we're also working on some of these things around slavery, as we were just discussing, right? We are running a campaign along with a broad coalition called End the Exception. End the Exception is all about ending that exception clause in the 13th Amendment to ensure that everyone understands slavery and involuntary servitude must be abolished for everyone without exception. And so we encourage people to visit endtheexception.com, where they can take action in just a matter of seconds to tell your Congress member that they should support what we are calling the Abolition Amendment. It's a new amendment that was introduced by Senator Merkley out of Oregon and Congresswoman Nikema Williams out of Atlanta, Georgia. That quite simply reads, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude may be imposed as punishment for a crime. So there are, we have endless number of campaigns that touch on this issue that, range, as we said, from the issue of telecom to prison labor, but also many others. You might be surprised. We're actually working on a death penalty case campaign right now, where there are corporations that are involved in making new death penalty protocols and creating new ways to essentially murder people. And so, you'd be I think the world would be pretty shocked to know just how much profiteering happens in this really, really dark space.
So, Bianca, I know this might be a little bit kind of like out of order in terms of the lineup we're talking about, but something kind of really specific transpired with me in terms of kind of why I picked up this flag of abolish private prisons and want to do this, right? So when I was in the county jail, I would hear from other cells when guys got sentenced down to prison, I would hear, what? I ain't got no family over there, right? And so they were sending guys to prisons where their family couldn't easily get to them. And it kept happening over and over and over as guys were getting sentenced. And I was like, you know what? That's not right. And so when it came to picking up this cause, it was very natural. Did you have an experience that kind of brought you to this?
Tank, thank you so much for sharing your story. With the folks. I think it's courageous, right, to hear about people's stories in this system, especially a system that is meant to rip people apart. And I know for me, I have my own personal experiences with this system and the criminal legal system as a young person who was adjudicated and had others close to me who interacted with the system. But I also think, at this point in time, with more than 2.2 million people in prison, it's something we all care about this issue. There was a recent study that showed that 1 in 2 adults in the U.S. actually has somebody in their nuclear family that was incarcerated. And we are just incarcerating people at a rate that no other nation in the entire world is. And so regardless of whether you have a personal experience in this field or in this system or not, it's time you also start paying attention.
There are many ways to get involved with the Prison Cells podcast, build your moral courage, and help us eradicate for-profit prisons in the U.S. Visit abolishprivateprisons.org today and build the momentum of abolishing private prisons by working with an organization to pass a resolution in support of the cause. Get to know the ins and outs of how private prisons operate and why. Outside of the site, you can write your congressperson and shed light on this awful practice. As always, please like, share, and subscribe to the Prison Cells podcast from wherever you listen. Now back to the discussion.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about working with abolished private prisons I've seen is like you can come to care about this issue through a lot of different paradigms, right? Like we work with groups from various different, what you traditionally think of as political aisles or something like that, right? Like we work with faith groups who think that the way that people are incarcerated and caged today is inhumane. They really care about the dignity of the person and how that's stripped away. That doesn't necessarily come from a place that their personal experience had, how they came to it. We also work with people who think that we spend way too much money on incarceration and jailing people, right? People that traditionally are conservative or libertarian and just think that it's way too much government reach into people's lives or taking too much money out of their pocketbook. So I think, there's a lot of ways that people can come to realize that the system of incarceration, the system of value extracting off the backs of people is wrong. And whether that comes from a left wing or a right wing problem, everybody can see that it's wrong.
Yeah, but real quick, hey Bianca, we should collab on some merch that says inmates are what? What is the word you like to use? People, right? So like, your
I'm gonna show you.
organization and our organization collab on some merch. That would be cool.
I have I'm gonna show you something. Sorry, I got to get up, and unfortunately, I'm gonna have to wrap in a second because I have a call at 3.
Yep.
But I'm gonna show you.
Let's go.
First. Nice.
Nice.
Yes.
I'm gonna get your number and we're gonna talk about a merch line and we're gonna go crazy.
Yeah, I like. You know what? I want a merch line. I want a merch line with the frame of "Fuck profits, free people."
All right, I like it. Go ahead, John. Sorry.
Hi, Bianca. This is John. So, first of
Hey,
all,
John.
thank you for your service through Worth Rises and other work that you do. And we at Abolish Private Prisons are proud to be part of your coalition to end the exception. Corporations, of course, develop strategic plans to maintain their business and to expand their business. And private prisons, for example, either own or manage or both with regard to prison facilities. But maybe, just maybe, public sentiment is moving away from privatizing prisons. Can you give some examples of other ways in which the profit incentive has gotten corporate actors into other aspects of the criminal justice system?
Absolutely. I mean, the industry is so vast, and unfortunately, it's expanding in many ways. I think like there are even the private prison companies are evolving now, right? As we start talking about criminal justice reform, right, and defunding police, all these things that are important conversations in public discourse. You are seeing now corporations starting to co-opt some of these arguments and then expanding their business. So, we're seeing that in probation. We're also seeing that in electronic monitoring, right? What we saw a lot during COVID is that we saw a lot of people be freed because we were like, this is actually unnecessary to be incarcerating all these folks. But unfortunately, a lot of those people were then put on electronic monitors. And as I heard one advocate, James Kilgore, say, who works extensively on electronic monitoring, electronic monitors turned my home into a prison and my family into guards, right? And that, like, understanding that is such an important framework, because what electronic monitoring is doing, for example, is not actually freeing people. It's putting people in a different type of confinement, and it's increasing the number of people in confinement because it's actually net widening. More people are being put on electronic monitors who would have never actually even gone to prison and shouldn't have even been on electronic monitors. And these monitors are routinely bringing people back in, right? And so, I mean, the industry is consistently evolving and finding ways to say, okay, if you're not going to let me make money here because advocacy is happening and families and communities and advocates are pushing back, then I'm going to redirect this and paint it. It's like putting lipstick on the pig and show you the solution that I have to offer. And what I've always said to people is if you created the problem, you do not get to be part of the solution.
Right.
We got that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Bianca, thank you so much for joining us today. If people are interested in your work, where can they go to find out more about you and what can they do to help?
Absolutely. Please, 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 people can visit us at worthrises.com. Please sign up for our newsletter. We'll get you some really interesting and important writing actions, campaigns where you can take action to change things. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, all the places at Worth Rises. If you're particularly interested in some of the ending prison slavery work, please visit endtheexception.com and visit and follow End the Exception on Twitter and Instagram as well. So, we invite people in every which way form to contribute. If you, have the capacity to donate, of course, we are a charitable organization that would love that support. But if you can just take action, it's also great too. You can educate your neighbors. That's great too. We have some really great resources on our site. And, just look forward to having more people join the fight.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Bianca.
Thanks, Bianca.
Thank you.